Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to add my voice to that of my colleagues in the House speaking on this bill. Last week, when we took the bill to the Committee on the Whole House of the House, I was outraged at the result of my colleagues' plea for common sense. A passionate plea for common sense. I was outraged. I couldn't believe it. And it was one of those moments where I was like, wow, this is actually how this works. And it was profoundly disappointing. I was shocked. But then, over the weekend, when I talked about it to people and I thought about it for a while, I remembered that this is the same government that refuses to offer paid leave for victims of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. At least they refuse to put it into legislation. They might put it into the regulations down the road, and we'll talk about that later. But in essence, in this room, they refuse to allow that to happen in legislation. It's the same government who refuses to put into legislation protections for vulnerable females on our campuses, of which there are many in this province. It's the same government. And let's not forget that it's also the same government that does a very bad job at bargaining with unions that have most of the healthcare unions and teachers unions, most of which are made up by women. So I'm kind of actually, you know, with sober second thought, I'm not that surprised at all what we're talking about here. My colleague mentioned this, and I want to talk about it again for a little bit. For the past couple of weeks, we've been watching, or last week in particular, we've been watching what's been going on in the States. The media is consumed with Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and with Brett Kavanaugh, and for good reason. It's an outrage what's going on in the United States, or what has just happened in the United States. But people will look to the States and go, oh my God, it's so good that we don't live there. Wow, it's such an outrage. But in fact, I would like to say, and I'm not being dramatic here, that there's not much difference about what is going on with that and what is going on right now. And I'll tell you that if people think it's outrageous for me to suggest that there's a link between that hearing or whatever it's called and what's happening today in this chamber, the link is one word, and it's called, fine. I would suggest it's called patriarchy. And well, you know, my colleague who didn't get into Hansard, but she said dictatorship, but I'll say patriarchy. And we should be in Nova Scotia just as outraged by what is happening today in this House as what people are, what's going on in the States. It may be a small thing that this, you know, it's like we're batting around months and days and weeks. And you may consider this a small thing, Mr. Speaker, but in fact, it's not. And it's all these tiny little things that are adding up to suggest that what's happening now is that Nova Scotians and women in Nova Scotia are living in a place where they face a giant wage gap, as my colleague has just described, where women discover that they must choose. They actually must choose between having a child or having a career. And again, in 2018, that just doesn't seem okay anymore. Nova Scotia is basically the worst place in Canada to be a woman right now. And for all the comments that this government makes about historical numbers of members of the legislature that are women, and for the protections of our wives and daughters, as our Premier loves to say, the government has actually not stepped up very much for women in my experience in this House. And women in this province should be very angry. This is a systemic problem, and women should be angry about it. Mr. Speaker, people often ask each other what their favorite season is, and I would like to say, if anyone asked me my favorite season, to quote the great Facebook meme that's going on right now, is the fall of the patriarchy, and I hope it comes soon. Thank you.